Welcome back to The Gospel According to Musical Theater, Race and Redemption, Session 3. But Peter and I are excited to dig into two beloved musicals with you tonight, The Music Man and West Side Story, both from 1957, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. I'm trying to think if there's any housekeeping bits we need to take care of first. Please do keep yourself muted unless you're contributing to the conversation. That will help both with everybody's sound quality where they are and also with our recording. We are recording all of these class sessions. They're going up on Trinity's YouTube page. So if you miss a session, you can go and find it there. And also fair game that we're mostly recording speaker view. So if you don't say anything, you should never be on camera. But if you do say something, you might be on camera. And if you would like your name not to be on camera, you can go into your preferences and take your name off of your shot. That way, you can speak with impunity and your name won't be broadcast on YouTube. I just wanted to give you that warning so that you are aware that you're being recorded. And also, we're trying to get better in the American context at what our Canadian friends have been good at for some time, which is acknowledging that the land on which we do our work and play and religion is not properly ours at all, at least here at Trinity Cathedral, where I'm broadcasting from. We are historically on the lands of the Multnomah and Clackamas peoples, and we honor their legacy, even as we work to make things right in some of the damage that was done that results in my being here. So that's a piece of what we're talking about in this course, a piece of what we're thinking about more generally as churches and as individuals in Canada and in the U.S. context. A reminder that this call is a fun hybrid of Canadians and Americans all talking about race together in our various contexts. I think that makes it more fun and much more interesting. I've learned a lot from my Canadian friends about race. And I know that my fellow Trinitarians, my fellow Oregonians and U.S. people are already learning some from our Canadian friends, and hopefully some of that's going vice versa. So we're very grateful for all of you on this call, wherever you happen to hail from. And as I said, tonight we are launching into 1957. Cast your mind back with me, if you would, to 1957. Some of you were around in 1957 and can speak personally to what the world was like in those days. Others of us have images in our mind of what it was, but 1957 is the year that we're looking at, not because that year is, although interesting things happened in 1957. This is the first year that the Voting Rights Act, actually it was then the Civil Rights Act, found its way to U.S. Congress. It was filibustered by Strom Thurmond, so it didn't go ahead that year. It took until 1964 for the Voting Rights Act to pass, but starts its way through the political system in 1957. And the day after, a little show called West Side Story opened on Broadway in New York. I think that was actually about this time. It was September 26th, I want to say, that West Side Story premiered. And the next day, I might have my dates wrong, but it was the end of September, right around this time of the year. The next day was when President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to escort the Little Rock Nine in the integration of that high school. One of the signature events that really began to launch in a much more public way the civil rights movement that had already been happening in the southern U.S. States and would soon spread across the country. So 1957 is a year in which there is already a lot of interesting work happening, conversations happening, and I want to suggest to you probably a great deal of anxiety in your average white American household around race, what it means to be an American. That's one of the questions that both The Music Man and West Side Story ask. It will be good to get our Canadian friends' perspective on that very navel-gazy question that American theater loves to ask and that Americans love to dwell on. What does it mean to be an American? So we're going to try to not be super parochial around that question tonight, but think about how both of these are musicals that are in many ways, I want to suggest to you, responding to the cultural context of 1957, particularly around questions of race and ethnicity, and difference and othering and violence, actually. Both of these are shows that deal with the phenomenon of violence, and they're both about communities. I mean, certainly West Side Story, right? We think about its origins in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, right? Two households both alike in dignity and fair Verona, where we lay our scene. Romeo and Juliet really begins as being about Verona and two warring families in the streets of Verona. Romeo and Juliet become the embodiment of that conflict, the ones who kind of pull the mask off of that conflict, if you like, and attempt to reconcile it, although they die in the process. It's a tragic version of the love story. The love trope really runs through the Broadway tradition. We all know this from Hollywood, right? That very often, especially in Broadway musicals, and this goes back to opera and to literature that well predates the Broadway tradition, but the idea of a male and a female love interest often is about, when it works dramatically, they're different, right? They have some key difference that in the first act threatens to keep them apart, right? They meet, they usually don't like one another for some reason, or there's some obstacle that they must overcome in order to come together at the end of it. And often that overcoming of obstacle in the heterosexual romance trope, the marriage plot, if we want to use that term, often that obstacle is to a certain degree symbolic, or a riff, a referendum, a way of talking about some larger conflict that is at work in the community, often the community in the play, but often more broadly in the community of the theater and the world in which it represents. So almost never are our hero and our heroine just about their own story. Almost always, there's some larger social conflict being reflected. And certainly that's true in West Side Story when we look at Tony and Maria, right? Which is in many ways a musical all about the gang violence that was on the front pages of most of the papers in 1957, not just in New York, but certainly in New York. So thinking about 1957, Tony and Maria as being very much characters of the moment, 1957, and just 2 months, 3 months after West Side Story opens to mixed reviews, some great acclaim, right? Was seen as a groundbreaking show when it opened, and also there were not everybody was a big fan of West Side Story. Walter Kerr, the New York Times theater critic, really lit into it. He had no great love for West Side Story. We might wonder about the fact that he himself was working on a musical that opened about 4 months later, so he was looking at the competing market. But that's a story for another time. 3 months after West Side Story opens, The Music Man opens on Broadway, and a few months later, in February of 1958, these two shows basically, they're the two hot properties on Broadway, and The Music Man wins all the Tonys. That's kind of the great irony of Broadway history, is that West Side Story, which we think of as perhaps one of the most groundbreaking musicals in the musical theater canon, won 2 Tonys, choreography and set design. So Music Man swept, right, and was the hot ticket in town. And one of the questions I want us to be thinking about tonight is, we tend to think of Music Man and West Side Story as very different shows, right? They're about very different stories. One of a contemporary story, contemporary for 1957. One of very much a nostalgia trip into 1912, Midwest Iowa. But part of what we're doing tonight is looking at these two shows almost as a kind of a diptych that I want to suggest to you tells us something interesting, maybe a lot of different interesting things about 1957, certainly, the year in which they premiered, and the Western culture, the American culture, the North American culture into which they entered and responded in some ways. So in what ways do The Music Man and West Side Story, in similar ways or in very different ways, respond to the cultural questions of 1957? It's also interesting to note that if and when the New York City Broadway scene opens up here in a couple months, once again, 2 revivals will premiere within weeks of one another. Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster in The Music Man, and Peter's friend, Isaac Porter, he's laughing because he and I've been talking about him. A very, very attractive young man playing Tony, whose name I've forgotten, in a new revival of West Side Story. Peter, you've unmuted. What's his name?
Isaac Cole Powell.
Isaac Cole Powell. I have to write this down. Isaac Cole Powell. If you want to see the new generation of Broadway performers, Google Isaac Cole Powell and watch some of the stuff that he's put out. He's a pretty incredible performer, and we're excited to see what he's... So once again, right, in 2020, The Music Man and West Side Story are opening within minutes of each other. And I want to here again suggest that these are 2 shows that seem to, at least as far as the Broadway market is concerned, seem to have some kind of contemporary resonance, or at least we're invited to wonder what kind of contemporary resonance they may have. I suspect that there will be a lot of people, in fact there already are a lot of people, who are saying, why are we reviving The Music Man again? This show's so dated. It does not speak to the concerns of 2020 with our interest in Black Lives Matter and the kind of conversations that we're having around polarization and race and all the things that we're talking about right now. There are also many people who say West Side Story is a show that needs to be relegated to the shelf because of the ways in which it presents, particularly Puerto Ricans, and the very kind of heavily stereotyped way in which Puerto Ricans are presented in that show. So once again, we're probably poised for a really interesting cultural conversation around what it means to revive shows like The Music Man and West Side Story. Why? And I anticipate that both of those shows are going to be the sought-after hot tickets on Broadway and are probably going to make bank. So what is it about these shows that contemporary audiences continue to find so compelling? I told you last week, when I tell my friends we're teaching this course on race and musical theater, and they say, what shows you doing? And I say, well, we're doing The Music Man. Everybody says, why The Music Man? That show has nothing to do with race. And at a certain level, it doesn't. It presents an all-white world. But the way that we're inviting you to think about both The Music Man and to a certain degree West Side Story tonight is that these are both shows, in a certain way, about the construction of whiteness. And in some ways, that's our topic, although West Side Story also deals with otherness, right? Puerto Ricans are the other in West Side Story. And we might think about whether or not whiteness, as we understand it in North American culture, necessitates an other. Is there such thing as whiteness unless we have some kind of racially or ethnically categorized other to define ourselves against? That's one thing that we might think about. What is the function of that other? How do especially for our purposes, how do musicals deal with this question of a dominant culture and a minority culture? How does that play out theatrically? What's being presented to us? What questions does it raise? And what blind spots do shows like The Music Man and West Side Story invite us to unpack a little bit? So that's one of our questions. And also thinking about the perpetual interest that we have, certainly as Americans, but as North Americans, in looking back to maybe 1957 and then even further back to 1912. We're in a time right now in America in which, nostalgia for a sort of patriotic mom, dad, and apple pie, barbershop quartets, and 4th of July picnics, Make America Great Again hats, that has a particular kind of political resonance. So is The Music Man perhaps a more political show than we would have thought? That's one of my questions to you. All of those are the questions we're going to be dealing with tonight. So that's a long way of kind of introducing some of this stuff. And I'm going to begin, I think, by talking a little bit about West Side Story first, and then we're going to send you into some conversation groups to think about this question of how whiteness is being constructed in 1957 and how we construct whiteness today. And then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about The Music Man and I think maybe consumerism and some of the other things. I think that's a little bit what we're going to, that's my suggestion to you of how we're going to proceed tonight. I got a thumbs up from Peter. So I'm going to invite you to think now first about West Side Story. This particular show that opens in 1957. In 1957 in New York, as many of you probably know because you lived through some version of this, the 50s are a really interesting moment in sort of the sociology of race in America. West Side Story was 10 years in development. Leonard Bernstein and Arthur Laurents and Jerome Roberts, the director-choreographer, started working on a project that was originally called East Side Story, about 10 years before West Side Story eventually opened up. And the original idea was kind of looking at Romeo and Juliet, right? What would it be like to update the story of Romeo and Juliet and put it in an urban context? And the original idea was East Side Story, as in the Lower East Side. What if we told the story of a Jewish family and I think it was an Italian Catholic family, around the time of Passover and Easter? It would have been the first time that we would have seen a Passover Seder on the Broadway stage. It took us another couple decades to get to Fiddler on the Roof, where we get at least Sabbath prayers on the Broadway stage. But nothing like Jewish worship and ritual had been done on Broadway. So this was a little bit, these are all second-generation Jewish immigrant guys who are working on this, right? Arthur Laurents, Leonard Bernstein, and Jerome Robbins are all descended from Jewish immigrants. So they have a personal relationship to the Lower East Side and the immigrant world that it represented, where some Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, and Jews are mixing. So a love story between, I think it was a Jewish girl and a Catholic boy. I think that was originally the sketch of it. But they realized as they began working on this idea of East Side Story that the particular kind of racial tension of the Lower East Side, Jews and Catholics, was really more and more a period piece, right? In fact, for a little while they were like, well, we're going to have to set it in the 20s, because that's really the last moment in American history where you had in the Lower East Side that kind of active racial tension between Catholics and Jews. Racial tension, right? And that's significant to think about. For the first, 20 years or so of the 20th century, at least in New York City, race tension, ethnic tension, was Jews and Catholics, right? That's how the story begins. Jewish writers looking kind of to their own history to think about their own take on ethnic tension. Realizing we're going to have to update it, they started reading the papers, right? There's all of these gang warfares that's happening on the Upper West Side. So with some time, that becomes the shift, and they begin to work on this for kind of uncritically for these Jewish writers. They sort of thought, well, it's going to be really easy to just shift the story, right? So it's no longer Jews and Catholics. Now it's Americans, and we're going to talk a little bit, I think, investigate who are it's the Jets, who are the American group, right? This is the group that Tony is a part of. What is their kind of ethnicity? But a group of Americans, still with some kind of Irish, Polish, Catholic kind of lumping together. And then now the other is Puerto Ricans, who is the newest sort of generation of immigrants to be seen on the New York streets. And kind of looking at a sort of ripped from the headlines story about Puerto Rican gangs and American gangs battling it out on the streets of the Upper West Side. That moment, though, 1957, right? Race tensions are happening in New York. We're seeing a change in the neighborhoods, right? So a lot of the original producers of West Side Story told these creators, like, you've got to talk about how neighborhoods that were once Catholic neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods, are now Puerto Rican neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. Like, we want to hear that story, right? How has the neighborhood changed? What happened to the Jews who grew up on the Lower East Side? Have they moved to the suburbs? Have they assimilated? Like, what's the story here? And the creators of West Side Story weren't really actually that interested in doing kind of urban history in that way. But that was really kind of one of the questions that was happening in New York, right? What is happening to the neighborhoods? Where these kind of ethnic groups that used to be battling it out, Catholics and Jews, are now all being lumped together in this new category. And what is that new category that includes Jews and Catholics and Polish immigrants and Irish immigrants and German immigrants, right? All of the groups that we used to see as representing the race problem in America, right? The race problem in America used to be about how the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment dealt with the other, and the others were immigrants. They were Italians and Irish and Jewish and Czechoslovakian and all these other kinds of races. So just a few years after this musical begins, Glazer and Moynihan published Beyond the Melting Pot, The Negroes, Puerto Ricans, Jews, Italians, and Irish of New York City. It was a sort of early groundbreaking sociological report around how race is playing out on the streets of New York City. And their kind of operating thesis, it was reasonable to believe that a new American type would emerge, a new nationality in which it would be a matter of indifference whether a man, we're thinking mid-century here, a person, was of Anglo-Saxon or German or Italian or Jewish origin. So taking what used to be an ethnic question of otherness and moving all of those ethnicities sociologically into one group, which here they're calling American. And that's kind of what West Side Story does, right? We create a gang of Americans, and we get little senses, right? We know Tony's of Polish descent. At one point, one of the sharks, I think, calls one of the Jets a Czech or something like that. So we get a sense that some of them are Czechoslovakian. But we're going to look at a scene in a minute and ask, like, who are these? Who are the Jets? What do they represent? Who is this American group? Arthur Laurents, who wrote the script to West Side Story, wrote this about them. The Sharks are Puerto Ricans. The Jets are an anthology of what is called American. So with that thought in mind, I want to show you a little bit of the opening scene of West Side Story from the film. This is a scene that I imagine many of you know well. But as we watch, we're just going to watch a little bit of this kind of opening ballet where we get to see these groups be introduced, right? This is, it takes you a good 20 minutes into West Side Story before you ever meet Tony and Maria. A lot of the beginning of West Side Story is creating the world. But I invite you to really look at how these two groups are being presented to you. What are the costume choices? What are the makeup choices? What are the movement choices, the characterization choices? How are these groups being coded, presented to you, particularly as we start to look at this question of how race is performed? So,
watch this shot. Hey, shoot, man, go. Hey, yeah.
Hey, watch it, Jet Boy. Hey, Jet Boy.
Come on.
Beat it.
I'm going to pause it there. It keeps going and it just keeps getting better and better. It's such good dancing. But the fight breaks out. They start rumbling in the streets. That's just a little taste of these opening minutes of West Side Story. So if you're a cultural anthropologist who's come into this, and this is what you know of mid-century American culture, or maybe beyond that, what do you learn just from this little 4 or 5 minutes of dance theater about race? How is Americanism being constructed, or whiteness, we might say? Who are the Jets? What do we learn about them just based on how they're presented to us in terms of costume, actors, hairstyle, dance movements, where they're presented, how they dance, where they dance, and who are Puerto Ricans? How are they presented to us in terms of who's playing them, how they're costumed, how they dance, where they dance, how they interact? There's a Hispanic critic of musical theater who has a fascinating piece on West Side Story, kind of a takedown of some of the really stereotypical aspects of West Side Story in terms of how Puerto Rican identity is presented. And he asks the question, how does the musical film, he's thinking about this film specifically, project ethnic difference as a threat to national, territorial, racial, and linguistic identity? I want to take just a moment before we move on. I'm going to hand it over to Peter here in just a second to talk a little bit about The Music Man. There's a lot more we could say about West Side Story. We haven't even talked about Maria and Tony. But I'm interested if there are some things that kind of came out of your breakout conversations that you want to bring to the whole group, either some observations, some questions, any gleanings from our time in breakout sessions to put on the floor for our whole group session.
Noticed hairstyles, notably Bernardo, George Shakira's, very, we thought very Elvis Presley, or the big hair. The one thing, just looking at the comment was the Jets had the streets, and the Jets had the basketball court, and the Sharks had the street. That maybe that was territorial. Yeah,
definitely some territorial wranglings. Yeah, and the Elvis connection is an interesting one. Interestingly, Elvis Presley was approached about playing Tony in the film of West Side Story. That, perhaps thankfully, never happened. Although, who knows? Why should I say thankfully? Elvis may have been an amazing Tony for all I know. Other thoughts, other gleanings.
I was in junior high in the 60s, and I'm just remembering that the hairstyle brought to mind, we had greasers and surfers there then. They were which one were you?
Yeah.
And that's very reminiscent of the Puerto Ricans or so being the greasers and the blonde kids being the surfers.
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because my sense of the creation of West Side Story is race. It was not really meant to be a show about race, right? It was meant to be a show about any kind of conflict, kind of pulling from Romeo and Juliet, right? So the idea of the creators was it's just, you can talk about Americans and Puerto Ricans just as easily as you can talk about Jews and Catholics, greasers and skaters, Capulets and Montagues. Basically all kind of in-group fighting is interchangeable. The critique has I think come later as we've begun to see that it's actually when skin color and race gets coded in particular ways, the conflict between a group of Americans and a group of Puerto Ricans might actually be very different than a conflict between a group of, say, Irish Catholics and Jews, because of the power differential there. So it's interesting to think about how universal is West Side Story. In many ways, it's presented to you as a universal story about human conflict. And how specific is it to a particular racial dynamic in the streets of New York in 1957? I don't think we need to necessarily answer that question, but it's an interesting one to hold. Is this a universal story about different groups in conflict, or is it a specific story about racial dynamics in a very particular moment in a very particular city?
Some of us were talking about the lack of difference, looking at it, looking at the clip, not seeing as much difference between the groups. Perhaps that's a relationship to today. But the difference between black and brown and white and the groups shown there, and the very things you're saying, because I can remember in Southern California, it was basically Pachucos and the Zoot Suit group, which were defined less by, well, I guess you could tell the difference, but strong animosities between white, basically the old white privileged idea. And these that were coming across the border, but so different from where it is today. I had trouble getting myself out of today and getting back to the 1950s, because when I looked at the two groups, and some of us, there are 3 or 4 of us in our group that agreed that there wasn't a lot of difference. And is that simply created by time?
It's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? The way in which even in our own lifetimes, categories of racial and ethnic difference have shifted in some really interesting ways. These are, as we've been saying all along, these are socially constructed categories, and they change. They are malleable, and in some ways, how we categorize difference doesn't actually really tell us anything about those individuals. It tells us a lot about the one who is doing the categorization, or the culture that needs to categorize in certain kinds of ways. Because those categories, those identifiers, they shift pretty remarkably. Yeah.
One of the things that when you were talking, it was interesting because you were saying the difference between Jewish and Catholics and Irish people and blah, 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 blah. But then West Side Story is about Americans and Puerto Ricans. And somehow that's a huge shift from Catholics and, it's a huge shift. It's very, very different to say American, Puerto Rican.
Yeah, I think we're probably more aware of that now than perhaps they were then. Bernstein and Laurents said, oh, that's easy, right? Actually, it was Stephen Sondheim who was the only one to kind of raise a flag, right? What he told them when they invited him to write the lyrics to the show was, I've never met a Puerto Rican and I've never been poor. I can't write this show. And they said, oh, Steve, that doesn't matter. It's a universal story. But I think now we're in a position to say, well, is that a universal story? Is it responsible for a bunch of pretty wealthy Jewish establishment guys to write for Puerto Rico? I mean, you look at a song like America, right, which was changed dramatically for the film because the pushback by Hispanic writers, Hispanic creators was so significant, right? America was seen as a really racist song. Interestingly, because it's all about race and who belongs. So they rewrote it for the movie, although the original lyrics are still being performed as I understand it. But this dynamic of who gets to, who decides how Puerto Ricans are presented, is this a universal story, or is this a very particular story being presented to a largely white audience about what Puerto Ricans are and what they represent, and what Americans are and what they represent? I think that's one of the tensions and one of the questions that we can hold, and in some ways a tension that brings us right to the door of The Music Man. I'm going to invite Peter to give us a little bit of an introduction to that view of American and whiteness and all that it represents. Take it away, Peter.
How many folks, I'm just going to scan around here, just raise your hand if you know The Music Man. Have you seen The Music Man? How many folks? That was my guess, that pretty much everybody, or 3/4 of those who I could see on the screen, know it. I love this show, and I say that because I think what's to follow might kind of destroy it for some of you, and I don't mean to do that. So I just want to start off saying I love The Music Man. I've seen it, seen at least 5 live productions of it. I saw the film with Robert Preston and Shirley Jones and Buddy Hackett and Paul Ford and Hermione Gingold. I saw it in its first release in 1962. I was a kid, so I've loved it for a long, long time. And one of the things I love about it is it's one of the few pieces of musical theater that springs completely from the imagination of its creator. The book, the lyrics, the music, all by Meredith Willson, one guy, not based on Romeo and Juliet, not based on James Michener's Tales in the South Pacific. This is a completely original work, drawing from Meredith Willson, the composer, was drawing from his own childhood in Iowa. The patter songs, the opening salesman on the railway train doing that talk, even some of Harold Hill's Trouble in River City and so forth, anticipate Lin-Manuel Miranda using rap by 60 years. Miranda himself pays homage to Meredith Willson's work in The Music Man in terms of what he created. It's got strong, memorable characters. You don't forget them. It's got great songs. including the only Broadway song that the Beatles covered, Till There Was You. They didn't sing any other Broadway, but they did sing Till There Was You. And it's a compelling story. It's a great story. No wonder it ran for almost 1,400 performances. And as Nathan has said, it won the Tony for Best Musical in 1957. The original cast album won the Grammy, and it was on the Billboard chart of best-selling albums for a record 245 weeks, virtually a full year. And the other thing I love about Music Man is it is performed regularly all around the world. Nathan's already mentioned the Broadway revival. It's had incarnations in the West End, but more importantly, it is performed by school and community theater school groups. Nathan has been in a production of it as well. He can talk about that if he wants. I've never been in a production of it. I'd love to. I almost got the role of Winthrop, but that's a whole other story. And it's, all you really need is a Harold Hill, a barbershop quartet, a Marion who can sing like an angel, a cute Winthrop, and a group of pick-a-little ladies who can camp it up with the best of them. If that sounds easy, think again. It's actually a devilishly hard show to put on a successful production. And having seen 5 productions of it, I think 1 out of the 5 was decent, and the rest lacked one of it. But at the heart of it, this is my main point, are 4 lies, 4 little white lies that I think kind of open the show up. So number 1, the depiction of the all-white world of River City makes it appear that this is normal. When the curtain goes up or when the set is lit and you've got it's a vision of Americana. And you have this notion that this little town has always been there, always. But even the name of the state celebrated in the ensemble's opening number, Iowa Stubborn. The name of the state comes from the indigenous people, the Iowa people who lived there from time immemorial until the arrival of the French colonizers in the Louisiana expansion. The indigenous people who were living in Iowa were settled farming communities. They weren't wanderers. They actually had developed a quite wonderful civilization in the state that became known as Iowa. They were resettled, is what the Wikipedia entry says, the number of different nations resettled. Isn't that a nice way of talking about erasure and disappearance into Kansas and Oklahoma? So that the settlers in the early 1800s came from the neighboring states. They were, of course, immigrants or descendants of immigrants from Ireland, like Mrs. Peru, Poland, Germany, Italy. The overwhelming sense, this is a little lie, this is the white lie. This is an overwhelming sense of a white community, an indigenous white community is a lie. It's a bunch of immigrants. It's a group of immigrants who have displaced people from their land and sought to set up a little bit of European culture in an American key in the heartland of the US. So that's lie number 1. Lie number 2 is my favorite, and some of you may disagree with it. And Nathan has heard this endlessly, but Winthrop is not, in my view, and I have no real data for this, but once I took this view, I can't see Music Man ever another way. Winthrop is not the librarian's mother, Little Winthrop, played by Ronnie Howard in the play. Well, there's nothing specific in the book or libretto to challenge that he's not her brother. It's highly unlikely. The variation in their ages just doesn't make sense. More likely, my thesis is that Winthrop is Marion's son from a non-marital relationship. This was not at all uncommon in the turn of the century, that when Music Man is set, 1912, that a daughter has a child out of wedlock and her parents adopt the child as their own to save the daughter's reputation. So it's a little lie, little white lie. And if this is the case, it makes better sense of why Marion's heart is strangely warmed toward Harold Hill, because in his scam, in Harold Hill's scam, and it's nothing short of a scam, the boys' band, Winthrop, who's a largely bullied kid. Nathan and I had a long discussion about the lisp. You can't really have a lisping little boy because that's going to read gay on the stage, and you can't do that in 1957. So his lisp is highly exaggerated. He's a bullied kid because of his speech impediment, but because of the promise of the brass band, he's given a greater sense of confidence and a zest for living, all based on Harold Hill's white lie. And the third white lie is the think method. Remember the think method? Harold Hill told the boys that if they could only think about the minuet in G, they could play it. That's all you need to do music. Now, the think method is and I have no data around this, but it seems to me, it's not too cleverly disguised send-up of Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking, which was a bestseller, New York Times bestseller list in 1952. So if you were in the theater in 1957 and they started talking about the think method, of course, you would go to Norman Vincent Peale. This notion that you can make something so by simply imagining it was gaining popularity in the US and in Canada. It influenced, among others, the family of now President Donald Trump. That was where they went to church. They went to Dr. Peale's church. Well, Dr. Peale sought to Christianize the idea of positive thinking. It has its roots in the New Thought movement, which looks to theosophy and world religions and spawned movements like Christian Science and Unity. Positive thinking and various kinds of mental gymnastics, including the power of suggestion, were widely used by traveling salesmen like Harold Hill and the like to convince people to purchase goods and services, making claims that they would vastly improve people's fortunes and life circumstances. It's another little white lie. If any of this sense of promising lots of stuff and not delivering, of using positive thinking, and if you imagine it, it can be so. If that makes you think of a certain figure, a real estate developer from New York, much in the news these days, it's not too far a stretch from Harold Hill, in my view, to Donald Trump. But that's maybe for another day and maybe a bit too political for a Canadian in the midst of an election cycle to comment on. And my last little white lie, and then let's talk about it together, is the conviction that lies at the heart of consumerism. And that is that our lives are made immeasurably better by the acquisition of consumer goods. Our economic system depends on this. And this is celebrated in The Music Man, and the big number that ends the first act, when the Wells Fargo wagon comes into River City with all the consumer goods that the town folks had purchased through the various traveling salesmen who had passed through. The list of what folks get reads like an old-fashioned catalog or a descent down an Amazon rabbit hole. Maple sugar, a Mackinaw, grapefruit from Tampa, a bathtub and a cross-cut saw, curtains, dishes, a double boiler, salmon from Seattle, not Portland or Vancouver, a new rocking chair, raisins from Fresno, and a cannon for the courthouse square. All these items and more, including instruments and uniforms for a marching band, are promised as something special just for me, which poor old Winthrop can't even say. And he's set up like fodder on the stage to lisp his way through that. Something special just for me, and they are not. They may end up as a special gift or a treat, but they're manufactured for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to make money for the manufacturers. And the only way to sell them is to create a demand for them, an appetite. And to do that, you need marketers. And in the age before mass media, that was the traveling salesman who promised the world something special just for you, but sold you empty dreams that never truly satisfied, only creating a longing for more. It's a cycle that was well known in 1957 as people were moving to the suburbs and outfitting their homes. and it stays with us in 2020 with the deliveries coming now to our doors, not through the Wells Fargo wagon, but through your favorite courier service, offering the world and delivering very little. So a constructed white race, a lie about sexuality, the power of positive thinking and consumerism, these white lies at the heart of this fabulous show, The Music Man. And with that, back to you, Nathan.
Do you want to watch Wells Fargo Wagon? Is it worth a little clip?
Let's take
It is
2-3 minutes of Wells Fargo Wagon. It goes on for a while.
It does go on. We'll just watch a minute of it. It's one of the best earworms of our whole course, so we may as well just let it. If you're gonna eat pork, let it drip down your chin, right?
Any further? It's on page.
Papa, the wagon is coming this way.
Wells Fargo wagon?
It could be the band instruments.
The band instruments?
But Mayor Shin.
Later.
Wells Fargo wagon is a coming now. It's in a prepaid surprise on COD.
It could be curtains or dishes
Or a double boiler.
Or it could be.
Yes, it could be. Yes, you're right. It surely could be.
Something special.
Something very, very special now.
Just for me.
Oh, the Wells Fargo wagon is a coming down the street. Oh, don't let him pass my door. Oh, the Wells Fargo wagon is a coming down the street. I wish I knew what he was coming for.
I got some salmon from Seattle last September.
and I expect a new rocking chair. I hope I get my raisins from Fresno.
The DAR have sent a cannon for the courthouse square.
Oh, the Wells Fargo wagon, it's a coming now. I don't know how I can ever wait to see. It could be something for someone who is no relation, but it could be something special just for me.
Oh, we'll let that be the end of that. Thank you for indulging me, friends. The extra credit video for this course that we won't be showing, but I encourage you to Google it later on, is the SNL skit version of this with Lin-Manuel Miranda. Just Google Wells Fargo Wagon SNL, and it's a pretty lovely little takedown. So, The Music Man and Little White Lies. What does this show have to say about what it means to be white? Is The Music Man also, like West Side Story, constructing an image of whiteness or Americanness? And for The Music Man, Americanness and whiteness are pretty much mapped onto one another. What do we learn about what it means to be white, the construction of whiteness, from a show like The Music Man?
So I'm going to confess right off that I did a little bit of background work before this class and found an article in Studies in Musical Theater 2009 that actually compares The Music Man and West Side Story side by side. It's a fantastic article. And what they centered on, basically paralleling between the two, is that cultural decline often comes from outsiders. And I think that's a common theme between the two. In terms of The Music Man, when you spoke, Peter, about the instruments coming in and how they were just materialism and things like that, from my perspective, I think the forming of the band and the instruments and all further enhanced the idea that they are part of the in-group, that The Music Man in general was focusing on us versus them. Decline comes from the outside. There are references to that in the opening number that are quite racist, actually, when you talk about You've Got Trouble. I think the whole setup is us versus them. At one point in the song, Harold Hill backs up good cultural panic by referencing founders. It's all that kind of thing. And I think the two together, focus on urban decay. At one point in this article, it spoke about The Music Man being a sequel to Showboat Purged of Race. And that one thing I found very interesting, I tried to tie it back to the gospel aspect of this, in that a statement in the article said, that the national identity of the U.S. rests on the tension between urban and rural. And it got me thinking about how much church identity, not ours particularly, but church identity in general, also rests on a tension between perhaps us and them, inside and out. I thought it was an interesting exploration of that.
Thank you, Kate. There's a lot to unpack there, but certainly this dynamic of the threat of the outsider, right? Which both West Side Story and Music Man to a certain degree are kind of illustrating that. We might think about, who is the threat, or what is the threat in The Music Man, right? Harold Hill very, very efficaciously almost whips up a mob mentality, right? And think about the lyrics to Trouble, right? You got Trouble. Pool table is the identified problem here. But remember how he kind of, expands there, and there's a little bit, it's so fast you'd almost miss it, right? They'll be talking about ragtime, shameless music that'll grab your son, your daughter, in the arms of a jungle animal instinct, mass hysteria. Friends, the idle brain is the devil's playground. Jungle animal instinct and ragtime, right? Both of those, if we're listening carefully, that's race baiting, right? That's a very finely tuned reference to African American music. Ragtime, remember, we're going to get this when we get to actually the show Ragtime, but ragtime is the music of Harlem, and jungle animal instinct is probably knowing or unknowingly working with some really nasty racial stereotypes there. So there's a threat of otherness, and at least as far as that tiny little moment is concerned, the threat is African Americans and what their music represents. And you think about the way that The Music Man is in many ways about both the threat of music and the redemption that comes through. I mean, The Music Man is all about music, right? The image of the core is 76 trombones and all that represents, right? So the redemption, if you like, that is being offered to you in The Music Man at the end of it is the entire town coming together as a band, right? It's they're all kind of in step with one another. There's that in the movie, you sort of see they walk out on the porch and then they're kind of one by one, like, transfigured, if you like. They're suddenly in professional, actually kind of looking like very 1960s band uniforms, right? But they come alive. They become what they've been faking this entire time. They actually become a band. So the idea of The Music Man in some ways is the community, this insular, gossipy, nasty kind of, this kind of insidery community is redeemed, if you like, by the power of music that the think system brings into them. There's all kinds of kind of problems there, but music, and also by this love story at the center of it, right? Harold and Marion sort of represent two outsiders. Marion very much an outsider, right? The town has basically rejected her. She's the sadder but wiser girl. She runs the library, but we have questions about her relationship with Old Man Madison. Maybe there's a sense, as Peter has suggested to you, that Winthrop is the embodiment of that interesting past that Marion carries, but she's Irish, right? There's only a little bit of ethnicity in River City. The Perus are clearly Irish, and Tommy Gillis, the mayor, kind of malapropisms him as a Lithuanian. We're not quite sure what that means, but Tommy Gillis obviously is from somewhere else. Maybe he's a Lithuanian. God only knows what he is. But here again, right? The ethnic conflict in The Music Man is Irish, Lithuanian, and WASP, whatever we want to call that, right? Eulalie McKechnie-Shinn and everything she represents. That's the assimilation issue here. So, and then Harold Hill, right? The traveling salesman. And Peter's got some great things to say about the threat of the traveling salesman and all that represents in American culture, right? The threat of sexuality, the threat of the guy who passes through town and doesn't want to settle down, impregnates our women and then leaves us in the lurch, right? So there are threats from the outside all over The Music Man. The interesting question for me, and Peter and I talked about this a little bit, I pose it to you, at the end of The Music Man, love triumphs. Harold and Marion walk arm in arm down Main Street, leading the band. So what kind of a redemption is this? Has River City won? Is Harold Hill going to give up his traveling salesman ways and move in with Marion and Mrs. Peru and become part of the town? Or is there a more complicated redemption? Are Marion and Harold gonna realize after a year in River City, boy, this place is a nightmare, and run to New York City, and she's gonna join the traveling chorus, and he's gonna become the impresario that creates Showboat? I mean, what is the redemption does the community win over the threat of the outsider? Is The Music Man really a story about assimilation? Or is it a story about a community that is redeemed by its engagement with the outsider and its willingness to learn how to sing and dance music from outside that at first is a threat, right? You think about the kids coming in to dance the shapoopy, right? Mayor Shin will have none of it. But eventually, he and his wife march in the band with everybody else. So has the community won, or has the community been redeemed? I offer that to you as in many ways, a theological question. And I think it's similar to the question that Kate's asking about churches, right? Do we think that our redemption comes when we assimilate those from outside and make them like us? Or is there a deeper offer of our own transformation at play, maybe through music?
I really have the image of that community breaking open via the avenue of music. That was sort of the tool, that they had just an extraordinary conformity at the very beginning. And with the inroads made by music and the relationships that happened, it sort of opened up creative avenues, creative opportunities, means of joining other people in the community, allowing things that had never been allowed before. In other words, it really broke open the psyche of that town to allow for things and to open up and experience things that made them a happier, more collaborative community.
That's a theological image, and I find it really compelling, right? The idea of River City at the end of the show as the redeemed community. We might even say a community that's a little bit closer to the kingdom of God, right? Because of their ability to engage an outsider, if we're going to think of theological concepts. Barb Milliken, you suggested assimilation, and I'm wondering if you want to argue for the other side of that question. Is this really an image of a redeemed community, or is it a community that has re-assimilated the outsider, gobbled him up, and made him one of theirs? Do you want to mount a defense of the opposite way?
Actually, the Pollyanna in me doesn't want to do that.
I don't want to do it either, but somebody needs to.
Because as a child, seeing this, I thought of it of many ways the way Pam did. Here's this outsider that they embraced, and he helped them open up. It was the 50s, so, and everybody was really conformist in the 50s. And so I'm sort of with Pam. I'm sorry. Don't
be sorry. I think this is a really interesting question about the Music Man.
I will definitely argue the other side.
Okay, awesome.
I will put community/church. My experience in the past that this is a community that made a way in, but I have the sense that they then circled around and absorbed. It was the idea of the small town that will always come together and support each other, and as long as you will fit in, you may stay and even do something interesting like play the trombone or dance, but you will still be encircled within that community's identity of itself.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And Thomas has put into the comments something that I think it kind of encapsulates this tension that you're identifying, Susan, right? A thriving community is a mosaic, not a melting pot. And in some ways, we might see those two images as, certainly at the heart of 1950s America, right? That's the name of the book that Moynihan and Glaser published, right? Beyond the Melting Pot. But moving beyond this idea of America as a melting pot, and that's an idea based very much around ethnicity, right? That America is the place where Italians, Irish, Czechs, Polacks, Jews lose, give up, assimilate, renounce their ethnic differences, and become a part of America, the melting pot, versus now what we're seeing in West Side Story, and certainly, and to a certain extent in The Music Man, a more nuanced idea that melting pot, assimilation, is often defined on the majority community's terms and actually does damage to individuals and to groups, whereas a more compelling idea might be something that allows Harold Hill to be a traveling salesman even once he's led the band. and allows Mrs. Peru to continue to, you know, be the kind of Irish mom she is, and begins to expand at the boundaries of River City, where you can actually start to see different kinds of faces. There's a really interesting Lincoln Center production of Lincoln City where Norm Lewis plays Harold Hill, an African-American singer. And the company's very deliberately race-blind casting, right? So, you know, there's African-Americans, there's Asian-Americans, there's Hispanic-Americans, all making up the mosaic of River City. All in Victorian costumes, right? Very much 1912 Americana. But what we're seeing are a bunch of non-white faces. In many ways, it sort of preempts the idea of Hamilton, right? What does it mean to present a very, quote-unquote, white American story with non-white faces? How does that change our sense of the kind of the community that we're striving for? But I think this is really a question that goes to the heart of the work that we try to do as churches, and in many ways, the work that many institutions are working at right now. How do we work at diversity in a way that helps us push at the human temptation to assimilate, especially when we belong, or when I'm one who belongs to the dominant culture, and I may not even see the ways in which what looks to me like building diversity is actually a bid at assimilation. I think it's a really interesting tension.
Yeah, there's a classic Canadian text comparing the way Canada got developed from the U.S. that's called The Vertical Mosaic, contrasting the U.S. as melting pot, and I think a bit of a romantic notion that Canada was much more mosaic. I mean, one of my friends who's a member of Parliament, like a member of Congress, says everything you need to know about Canada you can find from watching folk dancing in small communities, like the Ukrainians do their folk dances, and the Scandinavians and the English and the Scottish and so forth, but with this romantic vision of mosaic, all sort of side by side, each bringing the riches of their own European cultural backgrounds, and now West Indian and African and South Asian and so forth into Canada. But the notion of a mosaic of many different parts making a beautiful whole, very different from the melting pot. And I see in River City, Iowa, anyway, a melting pot. What is more, in our little small group on the break, we were talking about the way the Jets and the Sharks were clothed. The Jets in very bright colors, the Sharks in reds and blacks and all that sort of stuff. And nothing assimilates a group more than everybody in damn marching band uniforms. You know, you can't do much more than to put everybody in the same bloody, pardon my language, uniforms to try to say we're all alike in this thing. And similar to Nathan, the Stratford Festival of Canada, which is one of the great theater companies, the largest professional repertory theater company in North America, did a production just in 2018 of Music Man with an African-American, African-Canadian, a black Harold Hill. And when Harold Hill is run out of town, and the Chowns guys are following him with torches, and they're basically wanting to tar and feather him. It was a chilling moment, actually, because my mind, and I don't think I was the only one in the theater, even though it was a colorblind casting, they hired him because he's a great singer and dancer. But the connection to lynching was just this far away in my mind, with a bunch of white guys chasing the black guy out of town. At the heart of it, and I know Nathan was looking for them, are these plays that Mrs. Shin puts on, these pantomimes, these stories of the founding of the United States, making it into mythology. I mean, they set it up as fodder on the stage, and it's hysterically funny when you have good actors doing it. But in a chilling moment, one of the things that the ladies of the Pickle Little Ladies do in one of Eulalie Shin's pageants is dress up as Indians and do a little a war song that is chillingly offensive from 2020's point of view. I know Nathan was looking for it. I don't think we could actually find the clip.
I couldn't find the clip, but those of I wanted to find Hermione Gingold do it because nobody does it like Hermione Gingold. Molly Shannon does it, and it's just not the same. I love Molly Shannon, but she, gets up there and says, "I'm now going to count to 20 in the Indian tongue," and says, "Een, teen, tupper, feather, fip," and then a bomb goes off and mayhem ensues. But there's this one little moment. It's played for pure comedy, right? And in some ways, it's a send-up. Right? We're not meant to take her seriously. We're meant to laugh at her. She's being ridiculous. So one of my other questions about The Music Man is Meredith Willson either lovingly or maybe a little bit caustically critiquing and sending up the phenomenon of the small town that can't assimilate? Or is this a kind of, by cloaking it in the gentle satire of a loving takedown of small town norms, is it being presented to you as a kind of exercise in a kind of cultural nostalgia, where if you're not thinking critically, you walk out of The Music Man thinking, boy, that must have been a great time to live in America when things were so easy, and the marching band, everybody just marched in lockstep, and wasn't that wonderful? That's I pose that to you as a question. It's one that I wrestle with. Is the nostalgia that the Music Man kind of touches off for us? Is that what's that about? And why does it? And this is Elliott's question. Why is that maybe internationally a thing, but certainly here in the U.S. I mean, here we are with our fourth revival getting ready to mount on Broadway. It's a perennial thing. I wonder about in moments of stress in our national life, why it is we turn to the Music Man as a kind of, what is this, an image, an escape, cultural nostalgia is what Kate says, or is it more subtle than that? Are we being asked to be unsettled by that nostalgia?
I think it's an earlier time of almost innocence, and it was structured. It was everything was, you could anticipate. You knew what the rules were. It was conformity. And in conformity is often an extraordinary level of comfort and, an ability to function as a community because everybody knows the rules. From our perspective right now, that's a very, has very negative connotations. But, I think back to growing up in Orange County, California, John Birch territory when I near Disneyland, and I remember watching Music Man. I would never have thought about these sort of second layer of meaning and implications of what was being said. It was America, at an earlier time, less complicated.
Yeah. I think we can both appreciate the emotional appeal that something like that has, and also now as we are kind of looking with 2020 eyes to look at kind of what underlies that, and it's good for us to be unsettled by it, even as we find ourselves susceptible. I mean, I'm still susceptible to The Music Man. You start singing Lida Rose and I'm going to start weeping, right? That barbershop quartet makes me cry. It's so gorgeous. The barbershop quartet is the embodiment of white cultural superiority, right? I mean, you don't have barbershop quartets in African American communities. That's a thing that white men do. So I think this is kind of at the heart of this course, right? Inviting us to think critically, not to jettison the stuff we love, but to hold the tension that it invites us into. Disneyland embodies that nostalgia, I know. And my favorite thing to do when I go to California is to walk down Main Street and hang out and get a soda at the soda fountain. I mean, it just fills me with delight. But I'm also asked, I think, in this moment, to think about why that appeals to me. And what it means that it appeals, like what part of me does it appeal to? My nostalgia, my romanticizing, the fact that I am white and all of the privileges that accrue to that, the fact that that identity is right now a little bit under threat. And even as I try to work for change, there might be ways in which I'm not quite willing to let go of all that makes me white, powerful. That nostalgia might be pushing into some really deep stuff in me. And it is incumbent on me maybe to be a little bit uncomfortable by the comfort of that nostalgia, even though I'm going to look for a clip of Lida Rose as soon as we get off this call because I love that song. I think we can hold that tension as mature people. That's a piece of what I think it means to be spiritually mature in some ways. I'll just end by saying I think it's one of the things that we really wanted to do in this course was not just talk about race as a phenomenon of non-whiteness, but really investigate the ways in which whiteness is itself a cultural creation. And I think nothing helps us understand that better than nostalgia and the ways that nostalgia touches us. That's one of, I think, our canaries in the coal mine, if you like, for the ways in which our own racial identity as white people is itself a cultural construction, and that we are, in some ways, as susceptible to this. So I think it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of time thinking about how that works, and then how it gets exported around the world. But I thank you for being willing to take a deeper look at shows like The Music Man, which is, as Peter said, one of our favorite shows to talk about.